Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. Please wait one moment and we will get started. I'm just going to give everyone a second to join. All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started with the introductions. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Madison Calhoun. I'm the Senior Manager of Educational Programs at the Environmental Law Institute. Welcome to our Community Lawyering for Environmental Justice webinar. This is the first webinar in a series for community lawyering that ELI will be hosting. This part specifically focuses on the key concepts, skills, and practice-oriented specifics for community lawyering for environmental justice. We are so glad that you chose to attend the event today, and we are so excited to hear from these fantastic group of panelists that we have. I wanted to give a few logistical notes before we get started. First, we are offering CLE for this course in California, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. Several states have reciprocity with those. To obtain CLE, you needed to have included your CLE information when you registered. And when watching this webinar, you will need to have the webinar at the forefront of your computer screen, as the GoToWebinar software will be tracking your attentiveness and creating an attentiveness report for CLE. You'll need to be watching the webinar for the majority of the time in order to obtain your CLE credit. We will email you your CLE information and certification in the next week, but if you have any questions, please reach out to me at calhoun@eli.org. And we encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar, as we will have time for a Q&A at the end. Please don't wait to submit your questions, though. You can go ahead and submit them as soon as you think of them through the questions box on GoTo. Now that we have all of that out of the way, I'm thrilled to introduce you to our lovely moderator, Ariel King. Ariel is the Environmental Justice Staff Attorney at the Environmental Law Institute. Ariel brings to ELI a background in environmental racism analysis, political ecology, critical race theory, sustainability, civil rights law, and integrating equity and environmental justice considerations into climate action plans. She is passionate about making environmental education inclusive and accessible to all. Ariel holds a JD and a master's in environmental law and policy from Vermont Law School and a BA from Bard College at Simon's Rock. Ariel, I will turn things over to you, but I did want to thank the audience in advance for your engagement and thank Ariel and our panelists for their time today. So thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Madison. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we begin with the formal program, I want to acknowledge that I am joining this call from the Caribbean island of Montserrat, the native land of the indigenous Kali'ango people, or the Carib Arawak people. I try to begin all of my speaking engagements, even virtually, with a land acknowledgement as an act of honor and respect to the land and those who first inhabited it. So thank you all for joining us for this first webinar in a series of community lawyering for environmental justice. Environmental justice embraces the principle that all people deserve equal access to environmental protection and enforcement, recognizing that this, both historically and currently, often is not the case, and communities that receive the least benefits are experiencing the greatest environmental burdens. In the United States, these communities are predominantly low income and/or Black, Indigenous, people of color. The legal system has contributed to this unequal distribution of environmental burdens and benefits in many ways, and we at ELI are committed to providing research and educational tools to help alleviate the harm faced by environmental injustice communities across this nation and beyond. This series is the starting point of an ongoing effort to ensure that historically overlooked and underserved communities experiencing disproportionately high levels of environmental injustice receive remedies in ways that respect their lived experiences and prioritize their desired outcomes. The series and curriculum are offered to learn more about hearing, and we are specifically offering it as an entry course to any attorneys interested in participating in ELI's new Pro Bono Clearinghouse, which we are set to launch in the very near future. The Clearinghouse strives to ensure that communities with viable legal matters get the representation they need, whether that be in a courtroom, in front of an agency, or in a more facilitated or consulted fashion. This will be accomplished by connecting environmental law clinics with the many hundreds of environmental law members we have at ELI and our various collaborating organizations. So I encourage you to look on the ELI website and learn more about this and other EJ initiatives. And without further ado, I want to introduce this dynamic panel for our inaugural webinar of this series. First, we have Taylor Lilly, who is an environmental justice staff attorney at the Chesapeake Bay Foundation. She works to develop litigation to address disproportionate environmental impacts on vulnerable and marginalized communities. As part of this work, Taylor works with departments across CBF to develop relationships with community leaders and grassroots organizers throughout the watershed. Taylor graduated cum laude from the University of Florida with a BS in Forest Resources and Conservation. She earned her Juris Doctor from the University of Maryland Francis King Carey School of Law in 2018, where she received a Certificate of Concentration in Environmental Law. While in law school, she worked with the NAACP and the Maryland Environmental Law Clinic, participated in joint partnership between the University of Maryland and the Arava Institute, and worked with the University of Malawi Chancellor College of Law, Environmental Justice and Sustainability Clinic. Taylor is also an active member of the District of Columbia Bar. Next, we have Lanessa Owens Chaplin, who is an experienced lawyer and a demonstrated history of working in the nonprofit sector. As Director of Environmental Justice Projects at the American Civil Liberties Union of New York, she leads the statewide initiative to restore, uplift, and work alongside marginalized and environmental injustice communities, with a specific focus on addressing environmental racism. Skilled in civil liberties, civil rights, environmental justice, leadership, litigation, and intergovernmental relations, Ms. Owens Chaplin began her legal career in 2012 as a law associate at Hiscox Legal Aid. She joined the New York State Legislative House as legal counsel and later became Deputy Secretary of Intergovernmental Affairs to the Speaker of the New York State Assembly, working closely with government leaders on proposing, drafting, and negotiating policy reforms. Ms. Owens Chaplin helped found the Diversity and Inclusion Internship Program for the Central New York Law students. She is the founder and executive director of the Wilbert Herbert Johnson Bar Association of Central New York, the only Black bar association in the region. Finally, we have Seema Kakadi joining us from the University of Maryland Carey School of Law, where she started there in July 2017 and is currently an associate professor and director of the Environmental Law Clinic. Professor Kakaday's research interests are in the area of air pollution, climate change, and energy. She has published articles in the top environmental law journals, including the Harvard Law Review and Ecology Law Quarterly. Professor Kakaday's legal practice experience is in environmental regulation and enforcement. Her legal practice is in the clinic, specifically focuses on environmental justice matters in the Mid-Atlantic region. In 2018, the clinic received the American Bar Association's Best Student Program Award. And prior to joining the law school, Professor Kakaday served as a federal government attorney for the United States Environmental Protection Agency's Office of Civil Enforcement and the U.S. Department of Energy Office of General Counsel. At both agencies, she won numerous awards for her work, including several bronze and silver medals for service, and twice received the Administrator's Award of Excellence. Before her federal government practice, she worked as a research attorney and co-director of the India program at the Environmental Law Institute, and she also spent time as a litigation associate in private practice. She holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Wisconsin and a JD from the Washington University School of Law. She is the recipient of the 2019 ELI Futures Award and a fellow of the American College of Environmental Law. And so with that, I would like to remind everyone to please feel free to use the chat function to ask questions throughout this webinar, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. I would like to start this off with a roundtable discussion asking the first question of, what do you define as community lawyering for environmental justice? Lanessa, can you start with answering that question, please?
Sure, and thank you for that great introduction, Ariel, and thanks for picking me first to answer the questions. So yeah, I mean, I think, how do we define community lawyering in environmental justice communities? I think the way I would define it personally is I would define it as letting the community lead the work, right? So oftentimes as attorneys, by profession, we tend to be problem solvers. And so we want to go into situations and have these kind of predisposed ideas of how we can solve a problem. And it's kind of counterintuitive to what we do, but really taking a step back. And I always like to approach community lawyering as starting with listening sessions. So go into communities that I know have been impacted disproportionately by whatever factor, right? And so let's say they're overexposed to air pollution or some toxic facility is being proposed to be built in their community. I really want to start listening to them, understand what their concerns are, and then let them lead the work. And I think that's really what community lawyering is about, finding places you can plug, right? Maybe opening doors that they don't have access to, because you do have that ESQ behind your name, so you can have access to certain administrations or certain government officials. So really using your kind of expertise to help uplift and elevate their concerns. I think that's kind of the foundation of what community learning is.
Thank you so much. Do either Seema or Taylor have anything to add to that answer? If not, we can move to the next question. How could someone get started with community lawyering in their career? What advice do you have for lawyers who want to get more involved? Taylor, would you mind answering that question first?
Sure. I mean, well, one of the first steps is attending sessions like this to learn from folks who are, already existing in the field. But then the second, I think, is building authentic relationships with the communities that you're looking to support. A lot of folks, have the initial idea, I want to help a community, but what does that mean? Who are you looking to help? What are you looking to achieve? What are you looking to offer? And you can't just sort of throw your skills at someone and then expect them to accept them. You have to develop those authentic relationships to learn whether or not there is a need, whether or not there's a hole for you to fill, and what you can bring to the table. And community lawyering is to me, is a lot like community organizing, in that we're drawing on a lot more interpersonal connections than sort of the legal connections that we initially get taught in law school. So it requires us sort of take a different approach to the profession than what we have already known, traditional attorney-client relationships, and think more about who we're connecting with and how we want to build those relationships and what people can expect from working with us, what they can expect from partnering with us. So being clear just about what we're bringing to the table and acting as a resource, and as Nessa already said, putting the community first, I think are great steps to get engaged with community lawyering. And doing as much as you can to let folks know that you're out there, that you're available, that you're a resource is also helpful, because not everyone knows where to go to find that kind of support. So making yourself available and getting that information out there as widely as possible is always a great start to make sure that whoever needs you might be able to come to you.
Thank you. The next question kind of ties in with that, and I'm wondering, how does community lawyering, in your perspective, differ from the more traditional representation of lawyering that many attorneys are already familiar with? And Seema, would you want to tackle that question?
Sure, absolutely. So to me, community lawyering is actually quite different. I really think of community lawyering as a relationship with a community, which sometimes can be hard to define what the community is, and I can get back to that issue later. But what I really think a lot of it is understanding that there is a long-standing context to what the community might be facing, right? And so we talk about communities, but communities are not all one thing. They're all very different. And so communities that are located in certain areas might be very different than communities located in different areas. Urban environments versus rural. Western indigenous communities and Western lands very maybe different from an African-American community in a very different part of the United States. My clinic does a lot of work with communities in environmental justice areas internationally. So we've got different contexts for communities. I mean, I think it's really important in community lawyering to understand the place and the historical context from which that community is coming, because without that, it's very hard to navigate the multiple legal, regulatory, policy, social, economic, all of the different cumulative issues that will inevitably come up as you're working with that community. So to me, that's a really big distinction, is that this often a collection of people who have a shared experience and who really know quite a bit about what's going on in their area. And that means that it is, as Lanessa and Taylor are talking about, in many situations, a partnership, a common way of working together and moving things forward, given that community's perspective and given the historic context that community has.
Thank you. And so what I'm hearing is that one really important aspect of community lawyering is listening. And another really important aspect is prioritizing the needs of those who you are serving. And those who you are partnering with and working with. And so I'm wondering what other qualities are most important in a successful community lawyer, and what does success actually look like? Because I think it certainly can look different in this context versus a lot of other contexts that we see in legal practice. So I will start with Taylor for this one, and I would love to hear a little bit from everyone if you have thoughts to add to this particular question.
Yeah, I think one of the first things that I set aside when I started, engaging in community lawyering was ego. So setting aside the me of it all and developing partnerships. And I think that, we're very much fine-tuned in the legal profession to be advocating for ourselves and being as front-facing as possible. But as we've already, talked about a lot with communities, that does not get you anywhere with environmental justice communities, and often it impedes your success. So if you're going into a situation like Lanessa said, where you've predetermined what's already happening and you've also already determined that you're the best answer, sometimes you are unable to reach a successful point for community because you aren't able to address an issue that they're actually concerned about. And you might also not be the best partner. So you've taken up time and resources where you maybe could have found a different solution. And so I think while the ego aspect is pretty simple, it speaks to a lot of things, which is just recognizing who your partners are, recognizing that other individuals have value, even if they don't have an ESQ after their name, that they have something to add to a conversation, and letting that additional information guide the way you move forward. In terms of what success looks like, I think that depends on the community and what they're facing. Sometimes people feel as though they've achieved success just because they've identified a partner, because they have someone to support, because they've been in this fight for so long with no one to help them. And now that there's interest from other community groups, other environmental organizations, other lawyers, there's success because they have support. Other times it's completely getting rid of a project, which is not, a success that communities often face, but it is one that happens, and one that some are often looking to achieve. But I think that's always determined by the people on the ground themselves, and who will live with the project or issue long after we're there, or who hopefully won't live with it long after we're there. And I think that sometimes success changes. Sometimes as new facts come available, as the situation on the ground changes, that idea of success changes, but you won't know what that is unless you're in constant communication with your partners in the community. So you know that you're always continuing to work for the same goal, and you're continuing to bolster what they're working for and being an authentic partner. Again, I'll probably say authentic partner a lot during this, but it's just something that I always try to keep in mind when we're doing the work.
Thank you. Lanessa or Seema, do you have anything to add to that?
I mean, I was going to say, just to build off of what Taylor was saying, and I think we all kind of implied it, but just to name it as building trust. I think that's one of the key components to community lawyering, especially when you're talking about how do you define success, right? So sometimes success could be, I built trust with the community, and also moving out of your own way and thinking about maybe things are outside your wheelhouse, but it's really important to this community member, or it's really important to this community group. For example, I may go in there with a bigger picture environmental justice issue, but if all the neighbors are talking about is the pothole that's on the corner, right? I'm gonna have to step outside my comfort zone, right? Because that pothole is really impacting their life and it's taking priority. So not get stuck in a situation where you're thinking, no, we have to talk about this new facility that's being built in your community. It's like, well, what can I do? Can I write a letter on a letterhead from an attorney's office to the city to fix the pothole, right? Because if you can fix that pothole for this community, that builds trust, right? So now they're starting to celebrate the small wins and the small successes. And so they start to kind of put their trust in you, that you're capable and competent of handling other issues for them that are much larger, or maybe that are just not as dire. Because honestly, you go into a community where, as an attorney, we're probably financially secure. We're probably not worrying about how to pay our rent. And so when you go into these communities and ask them to borrow their very, very, very valuable time, you have to consider, what are they sacrificing to be here? And I often remind folks, I'm probably the only person in this room that's getting paid to be here, right? So don't ever feel like you can insult me, like put the pressure on me. Like, I'm here for you to put the pressure on me. That's why I'm in this room. And so really creating like an open, honest relationship with the community where there's trust there. And they can yell at you when you've done something that doesn't make them happy, and they can also celebrate with you when you guys have those successes.
I'll just add as well, Ariel, building on what Taylor and Lanessa have said, which I couldn't agree with more. I couldn't agree with more with it. Building trust and ego are two incredibly important things. I will also add that I think empowerment is incredibly important in community lawyering. You know, from the perspective that I take in my clinic, we have to be very careful about the amount of work we can do because of our capacity. You know, we've got students that operate in the clinic, and the students are there for a school year, which often means if a community group is coming to me for help in the middle of the summer, I might not have students that can work on that matter. And so I think several people that are listening might be thinking about taking on, say, one pro bono matter, for example, in addition to some of the other work that they're doing, and really thinking about that role and figuring out what is it that you can do. And sometimes we find in the clinic that's incredibly frustrating because we are strapped on capacity, and all pro bono folks working in pro bono or low bono or in the nonprofit sector always find themselves at a place in which you want to be doing so much, and there's only so much you can do because there is just resource needs and resource gaps in what you can provide. And so I really think, as a part of community lawyering, a big part is thinking through how to empower communities. And so, for example, in my clinic, we do a lot in the vein of community legal education. We do a lot just by way of consulting with communities and talking to them, as Taylor pointed out, that sometimes it is just the listening, and that's the piece we can do at this point in time. Sometimes, as Lanessa said, it's writing a letter on one issue. And so there is a way, I think, to build these pieces that are about trust, but it's also about empowering the community to be thinking about issues and working actively on issues for themselves.
Thank you. Thank you all for these thoughtful answers. The next question I have is, do you have any recommendations for folks who might want to read or learn more on the topic of community lawyering? And I will let anyone answer who has immediate thoughts to answer that.
I'm happy to chime in. Anyone with time and a Westlaw account should go into secondary sources and type in community lawyering. There's a ton written about community lawyering, I think, in the academic space that can be really interesting. A lot of it is written by clinic directors in various spaces, even outside the environmental context, in the context of community economic development, in the context of criminal justice, in the context of access to justice, broadly speaking. So I think there is a lot of really interesting work out there in the community lawyering space in other areas besides environmental justice that is really relevant to a justice framework big picture. And I think there's a lot written out there, even if you don't have access to Westlaw, that is on community lawyering that is really helpful. And beyond that, I think there's really great programs that are going on through webinars at your local legal aid, for example, that are maybe putting on programs that are really addressing some of the issues and difficulties and success stories and wonderful relationship building in the community lawyering space. That is short of reading, but it is really attending programs that are available. And I think a lot of that is thinking about justice widely, and thinking about justice and how it relates to the environmental context. And there's so much in the world of justice. That's my view.
Thank you. Do Taylor or Lanessa have resources to share or things that they think people should know when looking for educational opportunities to learn more about community lawyering? All right, well, if not, no worries. That's why we're creating this series in the first place. So now we can switch over to the more formalized part of the presentation where each of our panelists are going to give some remarks and talk about their process for what happens when they are doing community lawyering from their particular places and professions. So we are going to start with Taylor. I believe you have a PowerPoint. I think it is all set up. So whenever you are ready, thank you.
Sure. So I'm going to try to advance the slides. So if I have any issues, feel free to take over. So this presentation is very much just sort of the accumulation of patterns, practices, tips that I have learned throughout the process of doing community lawyering. But I will emphasize that to me, environmental justice and community lawyering is very much a learning and growing space. That's not to say that any of these concepts are concrete. They're very much static, and the ideas with them can definitely be added to, and I will hope that they'll be added to the presenters and maybe even folks on this call, but I found them to be helpful starting spots to get going. A lot of environmental nonprofits over the last couple of years have sort of entered into the environmental justice space or have been asked to enter into the environmental justice space. And that is a tall order because environmental justice means a lot of different things to a lot of different people, and doing that well looks differently to a lot of different people. Environmental nonprofits like CVF have litigation departments, and we have for a very long time represented ourselves and our interests, and that's what we know how to do. But we also have the ability to represent individuals. And so the two avenues that are available for nonprofits to me are support and coordination and representation. So support and coordination asks us to sort of continue down that avenue where we've already been working. So representing our interests, acting on behalf of our organizations, but in doing so, supporting EJ communities and filling a hole in their advocacy where we're able to offer it. So that might look like bringing scientific expertise, bringing on all of our favorite air experts and water experts who usually submit additional comments or expertise along with our efforts, but asking them to look more specifically to what's happening to EJ communities or what's happening to public health, or using the resources that we have to bring on additional experts who can speak to that if we are not connecting to them already. Or sometimes, like in Virginia in the regulatory space where I work a lot, that also just looks like in creating public interest. In order to get permits reviewed at a certain level in Virginia, you need to have at least 25 people. So sometimes even just submitting a comment on a proposed permit allows us to raise an issue and ensure that there's a higher level of scrutiny in a community. And also identifying what the community is hoping to achieve. We might look at a proposed facility and say, all we want here is for you to have a different technology. But once you talk to an EJ community, you might determine that there's a siting issue, that it could go somewhere else, but there hasn't been enough information given at that stage. When we know that, we can add that information into our comments and make sure that we're also advocating for it as well. So we're supporting the community in our efforts, but we're still working within our general lane. There's also, which is something that a lot of you'll be familiar with, the representation avenue. So traditional attorney-client relationship, you've identified an individual, a group, or an entity that needs representation in a legal matter, and you're going to move forward with the goal of achieving some kind of resolution to an environmental justice issue. So those are the sort of two cabins that CVF has fallen into, and that a lot of nonprofits that we've worked with have fallen into. And you'll see throughout this presentation that we do a lot of work in the support and coordination space, but we also step into the representation space occasionally as well. So when we are introduced to an issue, we have this roadmap. I will emphasize now, we do not stay on track with this roadmap very often. These are the boxes, they're very neat and very common, But sometimes we start at one and we spend 6 months on one. Who are we working with? What's going on? Who has got the issue? And then once we've heard the issue, we say, okay, this sounds like it's a concern. What's going on? And then we get on Google, we go to a regulatory website, we go check the town hall, and the permit's already been granted, or it's not, the issue isn't exactly as it's been presented, or there is an issue, but it's not actually an environmental issue, or someone told us that we had a clean water act claim, but it was really just damaged pipes in a building. So definitely an issue, but that verify step is one we also spend a lot of time on, because it helps us determine, are we the right partners? What is actually happening? Where can we engage? And if we cannot engage, who should we be referring you to? And if we don't have anyone that we can refer you to, what kind of person should we be referring you to? And then once we've kind of spent probably 6 to 8 months on these first 3 steps, we get to the idea of developing a plan. And this really goes to the support or coordination or representation step. So if we're doing support and coordination, then we're likely having really frequent meetings with the people that we have identified the issue to us, or with the organizations that have identified the issue, to determine what those next steps are. Is there a public meeting? Can we file comments? Are we appealing a permit? Have we engaged before? Who has an interest? What can we do? Where can we lend support? And then we get to the implement, which is such a nice little box on here, but is never the nicest box once you get to that final stage. So you've probably heard a lot of these concepts already from us talking, especially the first one, avoid predetermination. I think Vanessa brought that up already, but it's been one of the most important things that we've identified in engagement communities almost every time, not every time, but very frequently. When we go to a community, we hear, we're here to talk about coal ash, we're here to talk about water quality. And then we get to the community and they say, yes, those things are problems, but I'd really rather talk about the 9 toxic facilities in my neighborhood, or I'd really more interested in this proposed concrete batching plant. Can you do anything about that? And so avoiding determination saves your time and the community's time, because you're not spending time sort of preaching to them about what you think is wrong. You're learning what's important to them, and you're ensuring that you are, again, the best person to be there. And it also allows communities and other potential partners to introduce the issue, because that helps you frame it. So your preconception of what the issue might be might not encompass all those concerns, might not encompass the community's context with that issue. And the last one is probably the most important, being explicit about what it means to partner with you, what you intend to bring to the table. A lot of folks say, I'm here to help, but what does that help look like? What does it mean when you say that you're going to be there? Are you going to be on the phone every week? Are you going to call them once a month? Are you going to do this on your own? Were you just checking in once? Do you plan to fill them in as much as possible? What does it mean to be there? What does it mean to, what should they expect from you? How long will you be there? What is your end point? And that kind of communication is very difficult, I think, for a lot of folks, because you don't think about the extent to which you need to be explicit with what you're saying. And so listening first, like Vanessa said, allows you to make sure that you have the entirety of the situation covered and allows you to respond accurately. And then being consistent with what you're saying you're going to bring to the table. So if you tell someone, I'm going to engage in this effort until the end, I will be here until the end of the permitting process, I will appeal all the way through, and then 6 months later, you're like, actually, we don't have the resources, I don't have anything, but I haven't told you that we've changed our resources, so we can't do anything else. That's important. If you can't be consistent with what you're able to offer, you at least need to be consistent with communicating what you're able to offer. So it's always clear to everyone at every stage what they can expect from you. And the thoughtful assessment of the situation might seem a little base level, but it's kind of just like the basic law school suggestion: think before you speak. Think before you say what you have to offer, because on first blush you might think, I can only do these 1 to 3 things, but after fully evaluating the situation, you might have additional resources within your organization or additional resources within your network that you're able to bring to the table, and that just helps get the best result for the community. Ariel, are you able to advance? I can't advance for some reason. Oh, there it is. So preparing for the long term, a point of contact, I found it is extremely helpful, because sometimes, we bring with us the weight of our organization, our firm, our entity. So CBF is here to help you, but who at CBF? If I've got a question, who can I call? Can I call someone at CBF? Can I call someone at your organization? Who is that person? And how much information are they able to give me? This is really important in the support and coordination aspect, because we are not representing these individuals at the stage. We are working with them and in support of them. So we can only share so much information. We can only work to a specific end goal. I'm sure all of the community groups I work with are very tired of me saying this is not legal advice or my personal opinion is, but it's very important to be clear just so folks are fully representing their rights, so they also know what to expect from you. I found that it really changes the relationship because it allows them to be more strategic about who they're getting information from or how they're approaching situations. They're not expecting sort of legal representation from us and not expecting a complete picture of all of the legal avenues available to them in an area, and they're able to reach out to others in addition to us. So we really build an interconnected kind of web of support for communities when we're facing an issue. And that plan and exit strategy goes back to earlier points, which is identify how you're going to leave that community. Don't parachute in and just leave another day. When you end this issue, when you're done working on this issue, what does that look like? Well, when you get the proposed permit denied, when you get the project resolved, when you get the issue remediated, what are you going to do? What does that look like? Will you be saying bye and never seeing them again? Can they call you if something else comes up? Or if there comes a point where you are no longer of use, how do you communicate that to the community? When do you intend to communicate that to the community? When will they know that this is the last point for them? And I think that's also just extremely important because a lot of people might express interest in an issue at the early stages. Something might sort of be setting off EJ bright alarms, red flags flaring everywhere. And so everyone's like, okay, I want to be engaged in this issue, but that interest does not always hold. And that makes it really difficult for communities to know who their consistent partners are in an issue, who they can trust to engage on a project or a facility moving on. And so again, consistent communication, being clear about when and how you will act is always a key for us. So our kind of golden standard, our holy grail is the Friends of Buckingham case, because this was an example where we were both support and coordination, but we were also representation. You'll see the parties to the Friends of Buckingham case were the Friends of Buckingham organization and CBF, but CBF and SCLC, the Southern Environmental Law Center, were also counsel. So we were doing a little bit of both. The Buckingham compressor station was proposed as part of the larger Atlantic Coast Pipeline project in Buckingham County. The compressor station was proposed in a historically Black community. It was founded by freedmen, but when the station went before the Air Board, they said, well, we checked EJ screen and it says it's only 38% African American, so no EJ community. Also, looks like you're breathing air that's cleaner than the rest of Virginia, so no problem there either, don't worry about it. Well, obviously, the Friends of Buckingham said, I've lived here, my family has lived here, my friends have lived here for decades. I think we know what the community looks like. And even though the air is cleaner here, even though it's going to meet these standards, this compressor station is maybe a quarter mile away from my house. When these pollutants come out, they're going to hit me, I'm going to breathe them in. And so you can see here, again, love partners. This overshot was set up by the Virginia River Healers. They do a great job. They always do really good aerial representation, and we found it's really helpful for cases, for the Air Board, especially in times like this. But the compressor station was located very close to homes. And so when those individuals found out about the compressor station, they did so because they saw trees falling outside their door. So when they said, what's going on? They went to the Air Board, and the Air Board said, we checked out your community. It's not African American. And so they then partnered with organizations like CBF and with other anthropological organizations, and they conducted a door-to-door study. That door-to-door study found that, in fact, the community was not 38% minority, as the board had said, but 83%. And that is that was a very big fact for the court, because it showed that the board had not accurately considered all the information that's on the ground. I think we've got one more. Oop. Can we advance one more? Yeah, we can stay there. So once that permit had been approved by the board, it went to the Fourth Circuit. And this is one of those rare instances of success that we get to point to, not rare, but at least one that we're very excited about. On appeal, the Fourth Circuit found that the case had failed for environmental justice reasons. It also found a lot of deficits with the electrical components of the project, mainly that there were none, and that the board hadn't actually considered them. But the court found that the board had failed to do an environmental justice analysis of the community. And 3 points that the board found that on were based on the fact that they had not determined the character and degree of injury to the community. They had not determined the local population, i.e. that percent minority. And they also relied on evidence from the department. And all of those aspects were things that the Friends of Buckingham themselves developed, or that CBF worked to develop with them. And so that support on the ground and that development of the community was able to bring to the table ended up being the crux of that denial. And it was very exciting for the community, one, because they've been holding up no compressor station signs for decades, not decades, but months and months and months, and saying we don't want this here, and there was no expectation that it would actually happen, where you said we don't want this here. And then when it got overturned for environmental justice reasons, it just showed that there is success to be had, and that there is a responsibility on regulators to do their job, to determine the extent of injury to communities. And Buckingham has a lot of implications, though it was based on a Virginia state regulation, a good regulation, site suitability regulations, we love them, but it did show just the level of detail that can be given to EJ communities to determine the impact. And then, of course, in the summer of 2020, Dominion canceled the project, and so there is, in fact, no compressor station. But the main takeaway, I think, from this case is just to show, for us at least, is to show the role that nonprofits can have in supporting EJ communities. Because I think there was kind of an open question mark: what can we do here? What can we reasonably expect to get out of that? What will the community get out of this? What kind of support can we give them? And the answer was a lot, quite a lot. And this case has become a model for our work and hopefully for other work as well. But it's just the starting point. Hopefully we'll see more to come. There's, of course, lots of things pushing along, but for now, Buckingham is, again, our gold standard. And I think that's the end for me.
Excellent. You have brought up some really, really powerful points, and thank you so much for sharing them. And I do encourage people to continue sending questions in the chat, because we will get to as many of them as we can at the end. And so next we will have a presentation from Vanessa.
Thank you. And I very excited when Buckingham came out. We were in the middle of thinking about our litigation strategy for a local overexposed air pollution community, and this came out and was really, like, I think, one of the tools that we used to kind of scare off the agency that we were kind of having conversations with. So I think it has a lot more purposes than what you're thinking. And I'm just very grateful that work was done, because I think it hopefully will change the landscape moving forward, and definitely a gold standard. And for the folks on this call, if you're not familiar with that case, please go look it up. Let me see, I'm trying to move. Having no luck here. Okay, so I don't know why it's not working on my end. Oh, is that me? Sorry, guys. Okay. So yeah, my name is Vanessa Owens Chaplin. I work for the New York Civil Liberties Union. We have entered into the space of environmental justice just about 4 or 5 years ago, but we've been around for over 120, and we focus primarily on civil rights and civil liberties violations. And so I'm just going to kind of go over a brief overview of how we've come to environmental justice, and how we kind of came to this work organically through other projects that we were working on that we kind of identified as an environmental justice problem. So I'm not going to read this to you, but this is basically kind of what our stance is now on environmental justice. The NYCLU believes a person's quality of life should not depend on the color of their skin, their bank account, or their zip code. Our environmental justice work empowers low-income communities and communities of color to decide their future of what their neighborhood should look like. So that's kind of where we come from. And we have a couple different departments. And I think this is really important to highlight, because we're not a typical non-for-profit organization. I think large part because we've been around for a very long time, but also ultimately we are a law firm. And so we have a legal department, and our legal department holds most of our staff. And we have about 50 or 60 attorneys in the legal department, and we primarily focus on larger impact litigation. So we do take cases, but cases typically are if they're going to challenge some New York State Constitution or a federal or our U.S. Constitution, and how we can kind of make those big impact changes. And so that's pretty much what we do in the legal department. We also have a policy department, and what our policy department do is pretty much focus on state, New York State, and federal legislation that will impact civil rights or civil liberties, right? And now environmental justice. And so what we do is we just comb through legislation. In New York State, there's hundreds and hundreds of legislation that's introduced yearly. So the policy department comb through legislation. We actually draft legislation. We work with local and state and federal officials to draft legislation, amend legislation, or advocate for the abolishment of certain laws. We have a comms department, which I know a lot of not-for-profits don't have the funding to do. And so I'm putting myself out there as like, we do kind of stand from a place of privilege as far as our organization goes, because we are a well-funded, well-known organization. So we have a fully functioning comms department. And what we do in the comms department is they run our social medias, they run our pamphlets, they make things look fancy, right? They strategize about how we should message things. They do their analytics to determine what words work better in certain, right? What words work better in certain environments, and how do we move these initiatives forward? I mean, they do things like help make flyers. I mean, from the very basic to the very big picture things, we have a comms department that help work with us. And more recently, in the past, I think 4 years, we have the Education Policy Center, and that's a center that just focuses on education, right, and how it impacts the youth, school-age children, and campus organizers. And so we have our Education Policy Center. And that's where I, prior to this current position, I was the assistant director, and I had the pleasure of working with Ariel. Then we have the field department, and our field department is our organizers. And so we have a whole team of organizers that we can kind of collaborate with to say, hey, have you been on the ground about this issue? What's going on around this issue? Let's kind of pull people in. So we have all these departments. And so what we do typically is when we have a specific issue, we'll look and say, well, what's the best plan of action here, right? Should we start legislation? Should we think about litigation? Should this just be a purely kind of a communications issue, right? Do we just need to raise awareness? Do we need to make an educational campaign, a public education campaign? Or is it something that we need to start having forums about, get our organizers involved, right? Get people on the streets. And so we kind of think about how we want to approach a situation. And what I will say is, most of the time we're talking about environmental justice issues, it falls outside the legal department. And that's because the standard of judicial review is high deferential to the deciding agency, right? And so it makes it really hard to prevail on claims. That's why I kind of want to uplift again what Taylor talked about on how phenomenal that case was, because it's really hard to be successful on claims when you're talking about environmental justice. In large part, one, because the courts do have deferential preference to the agencies. They're not going to relitigate, right, the final decision or conclusions that an agency has come across, right? But also, there's no requirement to do the best by the community, right? They just have to have justifications on why they made those things happen. And so the standards are pretty much procedural. So if they crossed their T's and dotted their I's, litigation isn't always the best frame of mind. And so I think oftentimes as attorneys, we go into a situation very how can we litigate this? Who do we need to sue? What claim do we need to file? So as a part of being a community lawyer, that's really your last resort, right? So your last resort is, do I want to get into a situation where we're having to litigate a case that may not necessarily be a strong case, right? And so in my work in environmental justice, I think for the first step of community lawyering is you want to get out into the community. And I would just do a cautionary tale that I think we oftentimes work with coalition partners and other not-for-profits, but when I join those spaces, the first thing I'm looking for are impacted community members. I don't want to hear what the community has to say. I don't want to be told by a third party. I want to actually impacted person on that call with whatever coalition partner I'm working with. And if they haven't been able to establish those relationships, which obviously takes time, capacity, and resources, so it's not a judgment. It's okay, well, what can we do as the ACLU of New York, who do have resources, who do have field organizers, so we can get out there and get into the community? Because it's really important to understand what's happening on the ground. And so in large part, what we initially start doing, and I think it's kind of along the rubric that Taylor set up, is we go get to know the community. So we knock on doors, we hand out flyers, we make educational materials. And as a community lawyer, you will oftentimes find yourself trying to think about how can you draft an educational material that's only going to be 4 sentences because that's all it's going to fit on the Palm Pilot, right? So these are kind of things that you didn't learn in law school, but you're now in the situation where what kind of wording can I use to make sure this kind of sticks out to people when they read it and they actually want to come to the educational forum or the meeting or the listening meeting that we're going to host. And so a lot of that walking door to door, talking to community members is the first step of when I'm getting involved in an environmental justice project. And then the second step, right? So let's say we are working on an issue and we're not getting the kind of movement or public attention that we need. Again, because you want to kind of rile up the community when you're talking about environmental justice issues. we had a march, right? So the second step is like, well, how do we get folks together, like-minded people together, get them on the streets, make some noise? And this kind of serves a couple different purposes, right? One, you're going to get media attention, right? So when agencies are doing things in the dark, it's kind of a lot easier than when there's a spotlight on them and there's folks in the streets yelling with signs. And so what do we need to do as a community lawyer to help this march go, right? So you have folks in the community who are saying, we want to get out in the streets, we want to march. Okay, so I will learn the permit process. Let's apply for this permit. Let's make sure we have all the necessary protections that we need. Let's make sure we're paying whatever fines or fees we have to pay associated. Let's make sure we have, escorts. Let's make sure we have legal observers, all the things you want to make sure that you can be the person that's kind of like the point person to making sure that the march or the rally is successful. And so that's a part of community lawyering, right? Community says we want to have a march because folks aren't listening to us. Okay, let's figure out the steps we need to do to make sure that march actually happens. The other part of community lawyering is, again, because litigation is oftentimes the last resort, you do want to talk to that agency early and often, right? A lot of times I think as traditional lawyers, we don't necessarily want to talk early and often to the folks that we're thinking about potentially having an adversarial relationship with. But in community lawyering, if there's an agency that is planning an action, you want to reach out immediately and you want to start asking questions immediately. And that might mean public testimony. That might mean during the public comment period. That might be drafting a report. That might mean just simply submitting an email with, hey, here are some concerns from the community. How are you guys handling these concerns? You really want to create a point where you're having a kind of a conversation that is fruitful, because if you can get what you need from these agencies to put that in their early onset, the proposal and plans, it takes a lot of the fight away later. And so, for example, if they're drafting an environmental assessment, or they're drafting an EIS, which is an environmental impact statement, right? You want to get as much of the language that the community is asking for you. You want to get it in that original draft, right? You want to get it in that original copy. And so submitting comments, doing public testimony is one of the ways you can do that. You could also write public testimony or help write public testimony for a community member, right? Who want to put themselves out there. And we've done that too, where they said, like, can you just help me sit down and help me write this? I just want to get these words out and make sure people can understand me. Sure, right? So that's a part of the job. And so what I'll say is, for the key takeaways of like how we approach community lawyering at the NYCLU is, I'll just say this again, we really let the community lead the work. And we don't go in, again, what Taylor said, with preconceived notions of what we think needs to happen. For example, we had a major infrastructure project happening here on the ground in Syracuse, New York. And we thought, we obviously came in with the idea that removing a major highway in the middle of a community is a good thing, right? Because currently in this community, there is a major highway that carries over 100,000 cars, 3 feet away from people's homes, 10 feet away from elementary school. So we went in there, and I think we made the key mistake of like, obviously this thing has to come down. Community members were like, no, wait, I don't want change. I like it there. I like to have access to the highway and get to work in 3 minutes, right? Or this has been here since I've been born, or before I've been born. So like having that, okay, let's take a step back. Let's have a conversation and start a listening tour. And so we can really understand what the community is saying to us. And so like letting the community lead the work. Again, using all the tools you have in your toolbox. That might mean one day you're acting as an organizer, right? One day you're doing a public testimony. One day you're being an author and writing a 30-page report on, how this may impact the community, or you're starting a litigation, right? All those things in your toolbox can be used when you're talking about community lawyering and environmental justice. One of the things I had the pleasure of working with Ariel is we started drafting legislation. And that really kind of came out of this concept of it should not be this hard to convince an agency not to put a highway in the backyard of an elementary school, right? So as we're having this conversation, it kind of dawned on us, well, are they regulating this in other states? So we started to poke around, and we found out that there currently are 23 states that are regulating how close you can put a major roadway near a school. So we said, well, let's write some legislation, right? And so this is how these conversations have happened. And it was so integral to the community because they had never thought about, maybe we should write a law, right? Maybe we should stop rallying in the streets and start writing a law. And so what we shift gears, we wrote legislation, we actually had students from the school name the legislation, and then we started lobbying local state officials to say, who's going to carry this legislation for this community, right? And because we have that kind of backing of, it's already written, we've already identified the problem, who's going to actually carry this in the legislative houses? And so, I mean, last year it did pass the Senate. We're waiting for it to pass the Assembly this year. But those are some of the kind of things when you start thinking outside the box of what can you do for this community to help them, right? Let's just stop this problem. Like, let's stop fighting with the agency and see if we can kind of make a new regulation. And so that's one of the things that we can take away from that. And I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And now we'll turn it over to Seema.
Great, thank you, Ariel. Well, I'm Seema Kakade again from the University of Maryland Environmental Law Clinic. And for those of you that don't know what clinics are, they are programs in law school where students work on real legal regulatory policy matters. And so my clinic at the University of Maryland Law School focuses on environmental justice. There are somewhere between 40-ish or so environmental law clinics at law schools around the country. And we often collaborate with each other and work together where we might be taking similar kinds of matters, or we are jurisdictionally really close to each other and will collaborate on a matter. And what is really interesting about the kind of work that we do is we tend to focus on work that we can get done in a school year. That doesn't always work out because some of these matters take a very, very long time. And so what often happens, at least in my clinic and several other clinics, is that we work collaboratively with organizations like at Vanessa's organization or Taylor's organization, and I've worked quite a bit with both of them in various contexts. We also, at my clinic, work with pro bono counsel quite a bit. So private practice lawyer or a recently graduated law student that is just past the bar and is waiting for employment that wants to work on a matter. That's really helpful for us in the clinic space because we can work together as teams to develop that sort of continuity and that long-term relationship building and really getting into the community. It really increases our capacity. We also do work across other clinics, like I mentioned before. So clinics that might be operating in other justice spaces where there might be overlap on issues in the civil rights context or community economic development context. And so what does my clinic do? We handle an insane number of calls from community members all in the region. And so one of the first things that we do is figure out, okay, who is the community here? What are we talking about? Sometimes it is 3 or 4 individuals, right? Sometimes it is an actual 501c3 established nonprofit organization, right? A community association or a homeowners association. Sometimes it's a local watershed group. Sometimes it's just a group of neighbors, right? So we get a whole mix of different kinds of communities, some small, some established, not established, some big, some individuals. Sometimes they're parents through a local school like Vanessa was talking about. Sometimes there are retired folks that are really interested in navigating all of the historic context behind their community, and they've got some time and really want to push forward. So we deal with all kinds of different people. And so one of the first things we do is identify who is this community and how are they in relationship to other neighboring communities that might be in the same area. And does that community agree on where they want to go forward? Do they have differences? What are their perceptions? And so getting into the communities and understanding the individuals that make up that community, I think is really important, and one of the first things that we do in our clinic intake process when we get calls. The other thing we do is identify at what stage are we coming in to this community's issue. So it could be that we're coming in at a very brand new stage because several members have received notice that there's going to be new construction or a new facility or a new something or an expansion of an existing facility in their community, and they have notice, and that's why they're calling, okay? But sometimes we come in at a very different stage. It's a community that has actually submitted comment on a permit or participated in some sort of public participation venue, and their comments weren't listened to in their view, and they actually want to take the next step. And so now we're coming in at a very different stage of that process, okay? The other thing that we examine a lot is, right, what is the particular issue here? Sometimes we think it's a permit process for a clean water permit or a clean air permit. Sometimes, though, it's totally different. It's outside the traditional environmental space. It might be on energy affordability, and the actual issue is really on cost of someone's electricity. Or it might be a public housing issue and a mold issue, right? So there's multiple different issues. We actually also get a lot of inquiries on historic preservation. A lot of communities that are very concerned about historic issues that are coming up in their context. So we try to identify what is the issue, what time and point are we coming in to this conversation? Are there other attorneys that have worked on this in the past, or are working on it currently, at least one piece, or maybe a neighboring piece or a neighboring issue, and try to understand, you know, what other attorneys have been involved. So our intake process can take a long time because there's a lot of issues to work out and to understand before we figure out what our piece can be and who we might need to collaborate with, either another attorney that's already been involved or another community that might have a different view on where things should go. So we really spend our time in that intake process. And so I want to, Ariel, actually turn it over for a few minutes to two of my students who are pretty actively engaged this year in all kinds of intake processes. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over. Go ahead. I think that we've got Madeline's going to start.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Maddie Dwyer. I am a 3L, and I work under SEMA in the Maryland Environmental Law Clinic. I want to acknowledge that a lot of what I'm about to say is really echoing what's already been said by the panelists here, but I just wanted to share my perspective as someone who's really new to this space, and am really looking forward to my future career in really using the lessons I've learned in clinic so far to achieve these goals. So I've had a lot of great experiences in clinic, and two of the bigger takeaways that I wanted to talk about is keeping the bigger picture in mind and utilizing and respecting the expertise of the community members that are coming to the clinic or to you for help. So when it comes to the big picture, clients will often come to the clinic with a seemingly very specific issue or problem. However, as we start to have conversations with them, we realize that the one issue they came in with is actually just the tip of a much, much bigger iceberg, which is something that everyone has talked about so far. But just to give an example from my clinic experience, one time we had a community group come in and they were asking for help with a really specific procedural zoning issue. However, as we started meeting with them, we realized that this one issue implicated much, much more, including ethics, permitting, sustainable development, public transit policies, state legislative priorities, historic preservation goals, as well as the overarching themes of environmental and housing justice. And those were just to name a few. And so, although it seems fairly obvious that every complicated legal issue will be connected to many other complicated legal issues, seeing this firsthand has really changed the way that I approach these issues and plan to approach them in the future. So before, I thought I'd be tackling issues one at a time as they came up. I think that's really natural when someone comes to you for help. You want to immediately say, what's something I can do? What's the next step? Can I file something? Can I go to a hearing? Can I write a comment? However, my experience here has really taught me it's really essential to kind of pump the brakes and fully understand the entire scope of the issue before deciding what the next step should be. And so that way you can be more informed and make better decisions and not be blindsided by anything else that comes up later. And that actually transitions really well into my next takeaway that I've had so far, which is about community expertise, because as we've all been saying, the best source of information for accomplishing this more holistic understanding is, unsurprisingly, the community members themselves who are coming to the clinic for help. This is because every community is so different and their needs are extremely unique. Community members coming to the clinic for legal help know way more about the issues facing their community and dealing with a specific political landscape and historic contexts that apply there. And so although, we are future experts in environmental law or zoning law, we're not experts in what's happening on the ground, and we're not experts in what's happening in that community. So just as an example, in our zoning matter, we had weekly meetings with community members to try to understand all the issues they are facing, as well as what they had tried so far and what they thought the most effective next steps would be to accomplish their goals. And in fact, we're still trying to figure out the best way to help a lot of our clinic potential clients. And Margaret will actually talk a little bit more about some of the different roles a lawyer can play. So in closing, the biggest takeaways I've gotten so far to always keep that bigger picture in mind and utilizing the expertise of the community members coming to you for help. And as I said, this is really reframing all the ways that I've thought about these issues and plan to think about them in the future. And I'm going to pivot to Margaret, but thank you so much for having me today.
Thanks, Maddie. Hi, everyone. I'm Margaret Bushko. I'm a second-year law student at the University of Maryland, and I am also serving as a student attorney at the Environmental Law Clinic this academic year. A couple of the overarching themes that have emerged for me thus far also echo what Maddie just referenced in terms of the big picture and what Taylor and Lanessa discussed in terms of various types of support and coordination for communities and using different tools in our toolbox. Those themes have taken shape in my experience as the need to navigate and define where we fit in as one piece of a larger puzzle, and the importance of serving as a core resource for the community. In several of the matters that we've worked on, communities have come to us with one issue, but decades of systemic inequities have led to cumulative impacts on the community, which complicates the matter at hand. In these cases, we have to ask questions and attempt to understand the larger puzzle in order to define where our piece fits. For example, in one intake, we had a community reach out concerned about construction and new development adjacent to their neighborhood. This neighborhood is an historically Black community settled in the Reconstruction era. While members of the community reached out regarding an issue in the context of the NEPA review process, there were numerous other legal matters implicated, including historic preservation, zoning, state-level permitting, and public policy surrounding environmental justice. In this case, there were already other pro bono attorneys involved with a piece of the puzzle, the more localized state-level issues. We had to look at who else was involved, what the next steps would be, the amount of time those steps would take, and what we had the capacity to take on, and then offer our support for one piece of the puzzle with an understanding that the community was working with other lawyers, experts, and advocates. Another example that comes to mind is our work with a community group whose members are residents of an area that will be directly impacted by major train tunnel construction in the coming years. When our clinic team began working with them in the fall, we were primarily focused on reviewing the environmental assessments conducted under the NEPA process in the context of judicial review. Over the course of several months, as the legal issues at hand shifted and our understanding of the community's broader work with advocates, local politicians, experts, and other community groups grew, our piece of the puzzle shifted as well. We have adjusted our focus not only to a different legal matter, but to work with co-counsel, advocate for policy developments, and coordinate with technical experts in other areas. It has truly been a reminder that we cannot effectively do this work in an isolated bubble of the clinic and our community contacts. We have also been reminded that, as Professor Kakaday referenced, and as is so often the case with environmental law, there have already been years of administrative processes and community involvement with the project. So we have to not only define our own contribution, but look at what has already occurred. We cannot make the assumption ever that we're coming in at the beginning. We have to understand the larger picture and collaborate with other lawyers and experts to advocate on behalf of communities. And not only did our role in the larger picture shift, but I believe our team's understanding of our role as community lawyers shifted as well. In addition to researching environmental law issues, we're now striving to support the community through connections to technical experts, lawyers with other specializations, and deeper outreach into the community. So in this sense, the expansion of the scope of the work also led to the other overarching lesson, which is that a community lawyer needs to serve as a core resource beyond legal advice. Prior to working in the Environmental Law Clinic, I assumed that our work would be focused fairly concretely on learning the facts of a case and then taking judicial or administrative steps towards litigation. My view of our role has really transformed completely to be focused on advocacy work, keeping an eye out for points of collaboration in storytelling, other areas of legal expertise, scientific knowledge, community organizing, and legislative advocacy. I also wanted to mention that we've worked with communities internationally, particularly in West Africa, who are dealing with the same issues. There, similarly, litigation was only one aspect of community support that we considered. We also looked at storytelling, coordinating with experts, engaging local NGOs and the broader communities involved. So I now sort of envision a community at the hub of the wheel and a community lawyer's role as offering spokes on the wheel, connections and resources, and empowering the community group's voice to reach out and keep the wheel moving forward towards their goals. Reframing the role of an environmental lawyer in my mind has really changed my perspective to be less of a legal representative and more of a community advocate.
And Ariel, I don't think I can say it much better than those two students.
That was absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for your time. And so now if you're interested in staying on, we do want to have a Q&A period. So we are going to start with a question from the audience. First is, do you have recommendations on how to set reasonable expectations for communities for legal matters that may take years to play out? How do you maintain community interest and reduce burnout on matters that take years? And I am not sure who would want to answer that first. So if anyone would like to volunteer, maybe we'll let that happen.
I can just jump in. I mean, we've been working on a project that's been, discussed since 2010 in a real way, and then moving since 2014. And I really want to highlight the complication of keeping the community engaged. It's a really hard thing to do because you're asking folks to then, exert energy and time into a project that does not have a clear deadline or a timeline. But what I found very useful is setting realistic expectations. And I think that Taylor talked about that early on. Setting realistic expectations and boundaries of what you're going to be able to do, what you expect from the community and what they should expect from you. It's really some of the simplest ways to kind of create that relationship. And I think, Taylor talked about it in her presentation about that one step could take several months. And even though it may seem kind of like, yes, we're going to set expectations, but you really kind of have to detail out what your ability is as a community lawyer. Oftentimes, because you are a point of resource, I will tell you a cautionary tale, they will call you for everything, right? Because now you are a point of resource. So they will call you on completely unrelated matters, like, my cousin's uncle's nephew got a speeding ticket last week. So really, I mean, it's really a compliment to how much they trust you, right? So you want to be kind of delicate with that relationship, but I think setting boundaries and a realistic timeline like this could potentially take years, right? I think it kind of makes all the difference in the world.
I'll chime in as well. So at my clinic, we've done a variety of different approaches, and I don't think that there's a best approach. So sometimes we will define scope of work by a particular phase. So we can help at the public comment process, or we can help in litigating up through, circuit court, but not on appeal. If we're going to do appeal, we got to revisit this issue, right? So, or we can help in the Maryland State legislative process, which is this session in 2022. We've also done scope of work by time. So not by matter or phase or project, but by a specific period of time. So we will provide counseling services on all the issues that you want to bring up that are really related to the environmental situation you find that is surrounding your community for the calendar year, right? Or for a 4-month period. And I've done it both ways. And so I think there are pros and cons to doing it both ways, either limited by time, but dealing with a whole variety of issues, or limiting by a project or a particular phase of a specific issue.
Yeah, our approach has been pretty similar. We'd like to identify checkpoints for communication early on. So I mentioned that we worked with a community who's dealing with a lot of toxic facilities. The first time we met with them, they spent maybe 3 hours outlining everything they'd ever experienced. And at the end of it, they said, so what do we do now? And obviously, after getting all of the facts and situation, you can't reasonably or ethically say, this is the answer. So instead of saying, I don't know, I said, okay, right now it's December, whatever the date is, we'll plan for our next your next check-in with me to be January, this date. At that point, I'll have an idea of what kind of resources TBF is willing to dedicate to this issue and what ways we can help. And from there on, we'll check in every month, we'll check in every other month. Or in a situation where we go talk to a community member and they say, well, we've had this issue for the last 5 decades and you guys have been nowhere. So how do I trust that you actually care about this issue? Then it's okay, I will talk to you every week and I'll tell you everything I'm doing all the time. I promise, this is how we're going to do it. And so depending on the expectation or the issue or what the person's sentiment is on that, we usually have a timetable for how often we're communicating. And so it's kind of a rotating calendar of folks and calls just to check in with folks. Sometimes we don't have any updates. Sometimes it's everything's still moving, we're still researching. Other times it's there's been a major development. Sometimes it's maybe you want to have this call with this other group that I know instead, but it kind of just ensures the process is going to keep moving and gives folks something to look forward to, so they know that they haven't just identified an issue for you and now they have to wait to see when they hear from you again. And also make sure that keeps us accountable, because we are getting a lot of interest and thoughts from people. So if I know that I've got to check in with the community next week, I know that I can't let it fall off my plate for more than a couple of days because I've got to check in next week. And so obviously, the way that communication happens, once you're talking, 5-6 years in the future and you're still working on something, but in the immediate kind of interaction with the community, keeping that level of consistency is helpful, I think, for both parties.
Thank you. The next question, I think, can be directly addressed by Maddie or Margaret or anyone else on the call. But what new skills have you developed during law school that have helped you become a more powerful community advocate? And how does your law degree enhance that work?
So I can start with that a little. When it comes to how I'm utilizing my soon-to-be law degree, I feel like it's really bringing in a lot of, obviously, the legal research and just learning more about the space that I'm in. But I've actually found that a lot of what I've learned through clinic is a little bit less about those legal skills. As we were kind of saying, it really is a lot more about community building and really listening to the experts that are on the ground. So I think it's a little bit of both, really learning to listen while also trying to develop your skills as a legal professional and, utilizing resources like this to continue your legal education and figuring out the best ways to do research effectively.
Yeah, and I'll quickly second that. I think a lot of the skills that we're learning in law school are extremely helpful for the representation piece. A lot of the, writing, not that that doesn't come in here too, in terms of maybe writing a comment and some of the elements of the administrative process, but you definitely are building those tools through your legal education, the research and writing. And I've been really grateful for my clinic experience because that has definitely helped me become more of a community advocate. We had a class on listening, so I think it was Taylor or Lanessa, maybe both, that talked about the importance of listening to the community. So we've really been focused more on building those tools for being a community advocate, and as I mentioned earlier, also just reshaping one's mentality and overall approach to supporting the community in a broader way.
I'll build on that just a bit, and I will say that you can really look at community lawyering. I tend to look at it as like everything you're doing during this process is pre-litigation work, right? You're taking copious notes. You're documenting when you're meeting with agencies. You're documenting when you're emailing these agencies and their responses, right? And it makes a much more stronger and robust litigation. So if you do get to the point where you are litigating, you've already identified community members that are willing to be plaintiffs or organizations that are willing to be plaintiffs. You have copious notes to demonstrate that the agency has been on notice about these issues and complaints. And so it makes your litigation so much stronger when you're doing community lawyering, from my perspective, but I'm also biased to community lawyering. But
I'll just add to that that I agree very much with what everyone else has said. I think that really building a strong record cannot be understated, and also building amazing technical experts. We know that in environmental litigation in particular, so much is based on really battle of the expert issues that come up a lot. And so having access to the technical expertise, sometimes in our clinic with our communities, we will spend months just determining who is the best expert at the zoning administrative process, or who is the best expert to help in the draft permit comment, because that is setting it up for litigation later, and much stronger litigation later. Our clinic has also done work in the litigation space on environmental justice issues. And what often happens is sometimes those cases will settle. And so then there is also an issue of making sure that the communities are staying engaged in the post-settlement process. So it's a post-litigation process, which can also be lengthy, and particularly in very highly technical settlements, might also involve technical expertise in the post-case settlement process, which is a whole different phase.
Yeah, I'll just echo what everyone said. I think the most obvious change in our approach to community lawyering has been the level of detail that we apply at the regulatory level. I think prior to us engaging actively in environmental justice, when we were going to regulatory hearings, we treated it kind of like a check mark. We're doing our due diligence, we're just presenting the information. Now that we're actively attempting to support environmental justice communities and engaging community lawyering, we treat those a lot more like trials. And so we bring our experts with us to the regulatory hearings. Every time someone says something, we're like, I just want to clarify the record that I attempted to say this and they did not allow me to, just so we're clear. And we make sure everyone gets to comment. People sign on to our comments to make sure they preserve their right to appeal. We make sure to preserve every issue possible. And I think that that's what community lawyering requires of you, is making sure that you get all of the information on the record, because you never know until you've had the unfortunate incident of trying to appeal something or trying to seek redress, and they said, well, you didn't talk about it beforehand, or why weren't you here at this previous hearing? I know that sure there are six plants, but you guys weren't here when we permitted all 6 of those plants, so why do you care now? So now we have learned our lesson, communities have learned their lesson. We say everything all the time as clearly as possible, and get as many people as possible to say it. And I think that organizations also have a lot to do with that, because it means that we can ask our members to say it often too. So lots of witnesses, like Lanessa said, to what the agency is doing, and lots of people raising issues on the record.
Thank you. And so for our final question for today, first I want to thank everyone for sending in questions, and these will most certainly be guiding the rest of this curriculum, especially the questions we weren't able to answer. But I wanted to finish with this question of, as community lawyers or lawyers in general, how do you maintain your self-esteem or energy while experiencing losses and slow changes? And so Taylor, if I could start with you, I'm going to ask everyone to answer this if it's okay, and then we'll be done.
I think it depends on which day you ask me and which loss I'm dealing with. You know, I think overarching, I find it really satisfying to know that I get to be there for communities. When I was in law school and I was learning about all the information that we get as lawyers, it was really frustrating because I had family members who are doing all those things. And I was like, why are we telling me about this? Why aren't we telling the people about this? And so every time I engage with the community, I keep a little bit of self-esteem from the fact that I know that I am using my degree for a purpose that I believe in, and that I'm being a resource to communities who haven't had a resource for a long time. And also, as a lifelong environmentalist, it feels nice to move the movement towards EJ communities. But sometimes losses are difficult, especially when we're working with EJ communities, because that means that we've got multiple projects in one area. So for example, I work in Charles City County, and we've had 4 or 5 projects in the last 3 years. So every time we beat one, we've got another one coming up. So even the wins can kind of strain on your self-esteem. But I think that's the importance of developing really great partnerships and community webs, because when one of us is feeling drained and when one of us is taking on a lot, there's someone else who can step in to support the community and to keep everything moving so that we have time to build ourselves back up and we can be the best resources that we can be. And like I said, I may have a different answer the next time I experience loss, but for now, I draw a lot of strength from the community members who are just, you know, they have been on the ground for the longest, and they have brought us all there, and they've brought us all there with their passion, their dedication to the issue, and that keeps me going, because I know that even if I wasn't there, they were going to keep going, and so don't have time to think about me too much because they need me to be there for them.
Thank you. And Vanessa, how do you maintain your self-esteem and energy?
That's a really good question. And what I would say is it depends on the day. First of all, it really depends on the day, right? Because some days I'm exhausted and I'm like, I don't know if I can do this one more second. And other days, I can't wait to get into the community and like talk about this issue. But I really would say if you are like a pro bono attorney working on something, or if you're coming to the space new, I would say don't be afraid to delegate. Don't be afraid to say, I don't know. I don't have that answer. I think oftentimes communities who have been marginalized for a very long time have a lot of overwhelming problems, right? And you want to be the solver. So you have to let that go. And that goes with letting go of your ego and saying, I don't know the answer to that, but maybe someone here at this office will, or maybe my colleague will, or maybe this organization can help you. So just knowing when to get things off your plate, knowing that you don't have to become an expert and learn all of the intricate parts of environmental law, right? Think about experts, reach out to experts. Universities like where SEMA is are really helpful when you need like that expertise of people doing like deep dive and research. So just know that there is support out there. Seek that support when you're feeling overwhelmed. You don't have to know all the answers, and you know, you're just doing the best that you can. So I kind of remind myself, I'm one person, I'm doing the best that I can, and when I don't know the answers, I need to ask for help.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it to Margaret. Do you have thoughts on how you maintain self-esteem and energy while experiencing losses or slow changes? Probably not in practice, but even throughout the law school experience. I know there are a lot of law students who are on this call today.
Sure, yeah, I can only speak from very limited experience being a second-year law student, but I will say I've observed some lawyers that I really admire doing work in this space, who just do seem to be able to keep going. And I think that honestly, the community lawyering is helpful in that regard because, as I kind of referenced earlier, you're not always so dependent on a win in litigation. So sometimes I think a win is connecting a community group with an expert, or Again, kind of thinking of the international space, sometimes a win is educating the community about what is happening, or communicating with a government entity that hasn't developed really specific environmental regulations yet, and helping them through the rulemaking process. So I think a win can look like a lot of different things in this space, and it's not just a win or a loss in court. And so I think that is something that's helpful to kind of keep you going, because there's other ways to support the community.
Thank you. And Maddie, do you have thoughts on that?
Sure, I'll just add on one small thing. I couldn't agree more with what Margaret said, and also definitely coming from a place of limited experience. But, being a law student and only having, a few months of time on each issue or on each project has been a really unique experience. I'm getting to experience a lot of different things, and, a lot of potential wins, a lot of potential losses. And not necessarily always seeing them all the way through to the end before you have to move on to something else. So something I'm looking forward to is really being able to stick with one community or one project for a long time. So that will be a win for me in the future. But I think the last thing that I really wanted to emphasize with that is I find a lot of fulfillment of being a small part of something much bigger, and participating in things like Clinic and in these really important issues, I think, is a personal win. And although it's not about me, of course, it's something that can help you continue to do that work for these impacted communities and continue going forward.
Thank you. And last but certainly not least, Seema.
I will just say that I couldn't agree more with everything everyone said, but the last thing I'll say is, to me, what keeps you going is making connections with people. It is when we've got community groups that send my students boxes of chocolates because they're just so amazed by the work that they've done, or when we're on a Zoom call in the middle of COVID and we're talking to a community group late on a Thursday evening and we're exchanging recipes on what everyone's making for dinner that night, right? It is really the personal connections that I think are really the wins, because it is about connecting the environment to people.
Thank you. And with that, I want to thank you all for joining us as panelists today. Your expertise is invaluable, and I truly appreciate your willingness to join us and share all of this necessary information to advance environmental justice through community lawyering. Madison, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that's it. Thank you so much. Thank you, Ariel, Seema, Taylor, Lanessa, Maddie, and Margaret. We really appreciate it at ELI. And to our audience members, thank you so much for your engagement. As Ariel said, we'll use some of these questions that you asked to help determine future programming. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.